everybody, Mark here, and today I'm just going to do a little commentary because I was asked a question by my friend Ann Kai at Mag Express. She asked me this very specific question. Last week I talked about John Adams, my favorite founding father, and she posed two queries. She posed about John Adams' presidency and his relationship with Thomas Jefferson. Now, I don't overwrite out scripture, and sometimes I have a few notes, but most of the time I just kind of speak off the cuff. But today I'm even a little more off the cuff than usual. I'm just going from memory here and what I know about the subject matter, which I feel like I'm fairly well informed on. So I'm gonna talk about Adams and Jefferson first. I want to start there, even though it's the second question that was asked. I'm skipping. I like the second question better, I guess, or I want to approach that one first. And Adams and Jefferson have this really interesting, complicated history together throughout the founding fathers. Like, they're two of the most connected yet disparate. I mean, you have the wealthy upper crust, Virginia, let's combine the words, Virginia planter and slave owner Thomas Jefferson, and you have like middle class Massachusetts lawyer and John Adams. They're not really from similar backgrounds or similar sort of educations. They're both very educated men, and that's one of the things they do hold in common. And then the fact that they think America should have independence. Like, that's the thing they definitely agree on. And they make this, them and Ben Franklin, because Ben Franklin's also like the third of one of the major pushers for independence. Like, they make this great team. Franklin's good at sort of placating all the fears amongst the people. Adams is good at pounding the pulpit and like pushing for it. And Jefferson's really good at putting together these eloquent arguments. And so these three men are probably the three prime movers for independence. There's other people, of course, pushing for it, but these three get a lot of the credit because they are three of the most powerful movers. And then so Adams makes all the arguments on the floor because Jefferson's not a well-spoken man. He's not a great public speaker. That's all there is to it. And so they make a team. And even though they occasionally disagree on things or their disparate backgrounds, Adams being a much more pious, religious man, and Jefferson not having his doubts about religion, quite frankly, which I could talk about more, but I'm going to sort of skip over here. But the point is that they make a really good team, and they get independence pushed through. Of course, we get the Declaration of Independence. America just celebrated Independence Day, and they have a pretty good relationship. And Adams has a lot of respect for Jefferson, and Jefferson and Adams, they actually really do respect each other. And then they go off to Europe. They both, for different diplomatic missions, they both end up in Europe. And actually, Thomas forms a really great relationship with Abigail, John Adams' wife. Thomas Jefferson had this long history of really enjoying the company of smart women. And Abigail, by all standards of the day, was considered an extremely intelligent person. She was almost as smart as her husband, if not as smart as her husband, maybe even smarter. It just depends on how you look at it. I mean, we only have second-hand accounts. Definitely, probably John Adams equal. And so Jefferson builds this really nice friendship with Abigail Adams, and of course he continues to be friends with John Adams. And they're both kind of excited about the future at this point. They're both really all hyped up for the new United States. And then of course the Constitution comes into play, and the new government comes into play, and they sort of come at odds with each other. Adams is much more sort of conservative and very much afraid of the horde, right? The crowds of people. Not really very democratic. He's a little aristocratic, and he's not real excited about giving all the power to the people. He wants to keep some for the elite. And then Jefferson, of course, very much more into the myth of the farmer, right? The myth of the individual farmer. That's how the nation should be built. And he very much thinks that the thrones of people should be allowed to sort of control the government in some way. And so they're at odds with each other. And really hideous things are said during the campaigns for presidency in 1796 and 1800. But they're not said by each other. John Adams doesn't ever say anything hideous about Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson never directly says anything hideous about John Adams. They're always these proxies to these editors. Now, Jefferson was probably directly pushing the editors to say bad things about Adams. Well, Adams was sort of on the outs of the Federalist Party in 1800, and so he wasn't really pushing that as hard. Adams was a person who liked to think of himself as above the fray, and Jefferson understood better that you kind of got to get down in the fray if you actually want to win the office. It's part of the reason Adams ends up losing in 1800 is because he's not really willing to get down there and get really dirty. And I don't think Jefferson went particularly dirty. I really don't. But the two are definitely at odds right now. And I think Adams was sort of confused as to why they were at odds. He thought they could still get along. And Jefferson became convinced that Adams was the antithesis of the new America. And though Adams was a good person, like he still wasn't. I don't think he was really still outward condemning John Adams, but he felt like John Adams' ideas were just wrong, and felt like he should be out of the government, and the election was the way to do it, and that's how it worked out. So I guess in a way, despite their antagonism towards each other, there's still a reasonable nature between them. And of course, in the years that followed, John Adams became upset because he found out more and more Jefferson had a lot to do with the defaming of him. But in spite of that, because they were sort of old friends and they survived a long time, because both these men lived, John Adams was over 90 when he died, Jefferson well in his 80s. They both survived a long time. They were able to patch up their relationship through letters. They never saw each other again because of the distance of Virginia to Massachusetts and the difficulty of traveling, especially when you're a very old man, as they were. And the death of Abigail really pushed John Adams back towards his old friend Thomas Jefferson, looking for someone to hold on to as a friend. And so yeah, there was an antagonism between the two, but I think there was always a mutual respect and a friendship. They understood each other on some level, and in spite of the problems they had, there was always relationship between Adams and Jefferson, and they were different men from different places with different backgrounds, but still had a lot of things in common. And I think people tend to play up the antagonism because that's one of the most publicized things that happened between, because there's all these things written especially in the 1800 election. But directly between the two men, I don't think there was a lot. I think people always say that John Adams didn't go to Thomas Jefferson's inauguration, but I don't know if Adams felt like he was welcome, right? He's in the opposition, so why would he go to Jefferson's inauguration? It's a new thing. Now the presidents do that, right? The former president will always go to the coming president's inauguration. But at the time, there was no established pattern. There was nothing that George Washington didn't really go to Adams, so he was there. But so I never really saw that as a big deal. I think a lot of people point that Adams not going to Jefferson's inauguration is a big thing, but I don't think that's as major an issue. And so let me skip ahead to the second part. John Adams' presidency. Was John Adams a good president? The answer is yes, no. John Adams as president, I appreciate what he did. I appreciate that the French were antagonistically trying to get into war with the Americans in a way, and especially the Federalists that Adams was associated with, though never officially part of. Adams was always associated with the Federalists, and the French had antagonized the shipping lanes again with the Napoleonic Wars, which actually led to the War of 1812 with the English as well. So we had this whole sea battle, and we in a quasi-war where our merchant vessels are fighting French vessels. And there could have been all-out war. It had been very easy. It was the XYZ affair, which was the foreign affairs debacle in France for the Americans. And John Adams could have easily gone to war with France and actually been very popular. If he goes to war with France, he becomes very popular because he's a war president. And even back then, to be a war president would have probably got him re-elected in 1800. But John Adams, being a prudent, intelligent person, said, "This country is not prepared for war. It could be a disaster. Let us not fight this war. Let us not fight the French." And so he kept the Americans out of war with France. And I respect him for that. I think that's a great move to stay out of this possibly destructive war to a very new nation. 15 years since the end of the Revolution, America was not ready for another war, and John Adams kept him out. Negative consequence of the same thing, the Alien and Sedition Acts. Two of the worst pieces of legislation ever signed by a president. They basically violate the First Amendment, greatly inhibit free speech. They're just bad, bad legislation, and John Adams signed them and backed them, and he was wrong. And just, now it's like, oh. And now at the time, right, the government still knew, and Alien Sedition Acts were very common in European countries. But in this new democratic sort of thinking government, you couldn't do that. And John Adams hadn't realized that yet, and so he makes this major blunder. And it was an easy point for Jefferson and other Democratic Republicans to criticize him on, because it was a bad mistake. And so Adams' presidency is sort of split for me on this very prudent decision-making that was very wise, and then this really horrible, horrible act. And then, overall, Adams didn't understand this new democratic presidency. He didn't realize he had to extend himself to people. Maybe he was a little too elite, aristocratic in his nature, which is funny because he's actually one of the poorest founding fathers, but he didn't really understand how to appeal to the masses the way Jefferson did, and hence he loses in 1800. So there you go. Jefferson, Adams, good friends, tumultuous times, split them apart, came back together. And by the way, if anybody thinks Thomas Jefferson bore a grudge against John Adams, he immediately hires John Adams' son John Quincy for a number of posts during during Jefferson's presidency. Jefferson and Madison both do. So clearly they didn't hold enough of a grudge against him to not hire his son. There you go. So there you go. John Adams' presidency I'm mixed on, and Jefferson Adams. That's what I have to give you as little extemporaneous, off-the-cuff sort of thoughts on that very direct question, which I appreciate. Thank you for the question, Ankai. And thank you. I hope that gives you a little historical perspective.